The alarm did not sound. That was the first sign that something was fundamentally wrong in Sector Keth Dovar, the most densely monitored region of the entire Aurelian Commonwealth Galactic Empire. In 42 years of active service, Fleet Admiral Varek Soln had never witnessed a total failure in the Perpetual Vigil Sensor Network, the early detection system that covered a 200-light-year radius around Keth Dovar's orbital shipyards like a spider web woven from light and mathematics. The system had detected comets before they fully formed. It had tracked the trajectory of an interstellar dust grain 300 light-years away. It was, in the language of Aurelian engineers, imperfect only in theory. Therefore, when first-class operator Zethia burst through the command center door, all three eyes wide and his vocal membrane trembling in a way Varek had never seen in a trained subordinate, the Admiral knew, even before a word was spoken, that the day had changed its nature. "Admiral," Zethia said, and his voice came out fragmented, as if the syllables had to be forced out one by one. "There's a vessel in the inner ring." Varek turned his chair slowly. It was a habit cultivated over decades. Never show haste, for haste was the language of those who did not control the situation. "Which vessel?" Unidentified, Admiral. It's not in any registry." "Origin?" "Unknown. No hyperspace trail. No residual propulsion signature. No warp field echo. It's simply..." Zethia's vocal membrane trembled again. "Came into existence." Varek stood up. Keth Dovar's inner ring was only 32 seconds of sublight impulse travel away from the main shipyards, where 18 Sovereignty-class warships were under simultaneous construction. It was the most protected zone in the known galaxy. Penetrating it undetected by the Perpetual Vigil was not just improbable. It was, according to the Empire's best physicists, mathematically impossible. Varek walked down the corridor towards the holography room with steps that, despite all his training, were slightly faster than usual. The three-dimensional projection of the inner ring floated in the center of the room like a map of bluish light, and there, in the middle of a region where theoretically nothing unauthorized and uncatalogued could exist, was an object. A vessel. Varek estimated its dimensions by comparing them to known beacons nearby. 400 meters long, 70 wide, with a silhouette that followed no recognized propulsion geometry. There were no smooth curves of Aurelian ships, no fractal angles of the Dravathi builders, no spherical symmetry of the ancient Vassarians. This was angular, brutal, built as if beauty were an irrelevant variable in the design process. "Shields?" Varek asked. "We detect no containment field emission, Admiral, but active sensors return inconsistent readings. The hull appears to be composed of a dense metallic alloy, likely iron titanium, with alternating ceramic layers. It is not Aurelian technology. It is not technology of any recorded species." Varek observed the vessel in silence for a long moment. It wasn't moving. It wasn't transmitting. It was doing absolutely nothing but existing in that place where nothing should exist, with the disturbing calm of something that needs no justification. "Open a communication channel on all registered frequencies," Varek said, "including Central Archive First Contact protocols." The response came in the form of static, or rather, in the form of absence. The channel was open. The signal was being transmitted, and on the other side there was simply silence. Not the empty silence of deep space, the silence of something that listens and chooses not to respond. Varek felt, for the first time in decades, the thin, ancient thread of what his species called instinctive caution, something the Aurelians had partially lost over millennia of galactic supremacy, replaced by absolute confidence in their systems and the certainty that no other civilization could even approach their technological capability without being detected, catalogued, and, if necessary, contained. "Who is on that vessel?" Varek murmured, more to himself than to any subordinate present. The answer arrived, but not via communication. A secondary panel in the holography room lit up with an intelligence report that had been sealed by Council Order 72 standard years ago. The protocol analyst who had activated the file, a young operator named Leth Savan, who had clearly taken the initiative without authorization, approached with an expression that mixed apology with urgency. Admiral, triangulating the vessel's probable origin based on its residual trajectory and gravitational anomalies detected over the last 48 cycles, the system pointed to Outer Rim Sector 7. The Council's sealed records refer to that region as... She hesitated. Sol 3 Containment Zone? A biologically fragile species, confined by Quarantine Treaty 230 standard years ago. Designated primitive. Designated as non-threat. The treaty guaranteed they would never develop interstellar travel capability without Aurelian supervision. Varek looked at the report. Then he looked at the vessel in the holographic projection. Primitives, he repeated in a low voice. Yes, Admiral. They call themselves humans. Varek opened the communication channel again, and this time did not transmit the standard diplomatic protocol. He transmitted the voice of a fleet admiral of the Aurelian Commonwealth Galactic Empire, with all the authority that centuries of supremacy confer upon an intonation. Unidentified vessel in Imperial Restricted Zone. You have violated the Containment Treaty and invaded the sovereign space of the Aurelian Empire. Immediate surrender is the only option that guarantees your preservation. Halt your systems, eject your propulsion cores, and await boarding. Any other response will be interpreted as an act of war. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the human vessel responded, not with words, with a movement. It rotated slowly on its own axis, a 90-degree turn that brought its flanks into presentation position, and there, projected in relief on the dark metal hull in letters that no Aurelian translation system had been designed to decipher, was a name. The pattern recognition system took 14 seconds to process the unknown alphabet and another 8 to find a match in the deepest intelligence files, records collected by stealth observation drones decades before the Containment Treaty was signed. The vessel's name was Unbreakable Resistance. Varek read the translation twice. Then he looked at Leth Savan, who had visibly paled. Aurelian Containment Group, Varek said, his voice completely controlled, his haste completely suppressed, his authority intact like a shield. 7 vessels. Delta formation. Full encirclement. I want that craft immobilized and its occupants captured for interrogation. The Delta formation of 7 Sentinel-class warships began to organize around the unbreakable resistance with the millimeter precision of a dance rehearsed 1,000 times in simulation. The containment energy lances were already charged. The suppression fields were already active. In all the years of the containment group's operation, no vessel had resisted the Delta formation for more than 90 seconds. The human vessel remained silent. There was no nervousness in that silence. There was no hesitation. It was the silence of something that had calculated all angles and was merely awaiting the right moment to reveal that the others had been playing the wrong game from the start. Varek watched the formation close and felt, with a clarity that came too late, that this vessel was not waiting to be encircled. It was waiting for there to be no more doubt about the Empire's intentions. The first volley from the Aurelian energy lances illuminated Sector Keth Dovar with the light of a minor star and the history of the galaxy, though no one in the holography room yet knew it, had just irreversibly changed course. Varek Son watched the glow of the energy lances converging on the dark hull of the human vessel, and for a fraction of a second, he would never admit to any subordinate, felt he had made a fundamental mistake. Not the mistake of attacking. The mistake of assuming that the vessel's silence was weakness. Aurelian energy lances were considered the final word in offensive containment weaponry. Each released a coherent beam of highly energized plasma capable of melting the hull of any known vessel in a matter of seconds. 7 lances firing simultaneously in a converging delta formation represented a force that could, in theory, vaporize a small moon given enough time. In real combat against any vessel cataloged by the Imperial Archive, the result was always the same: surrender or destruction, usually the former, because any species intelligent enough to build an interstellar vessel was also intelligent enough to recognize the impossibility of resistance. The beams converged on the hull of the unbreakable resistance, and the hull absorbed the impact, not with energy shields, which would have glowed and oscillated at the recognizable frequency of a plasma containment field, not with particle deflectors, which would have scattered the beam in a characteristic interference pattern. The hull simply absorbed the impact as a mountain absorbs rain. The dark metallic alloy, iron, titanium, and something else that Imperial sensors could not yet identify, heated to an orange-red at the edges of the impact points, emitted metal vapor in quantities that sensors registered as clinically insignificant, and remained intact. In the holography room, Leth Savan made a sound that wasn't exactly a word. It was the sound of a fundamental assumption crumbling. "Admiral," she said, "hull temperature readings are." They're actively dissipating heat across the entire hull surface. The structure seems to function as an integrated thermal sink. It's a completely different solution from the energy shield paradigm. They're not blocking the plasma. They're redistributing the energy throughout the hull's mass. "Practical result?" asked Varek, whose voice had lost a minimal, imperceptible degree of its usual controlled temperature. "To destroy that hull with standard energy lances, we would need approximately 40 times the power of any containment weaponry we have in this formation. It would require a line ship's main cannon. Intensify fire. Use variable frequency emitters." Variable frequency emitters were the Aurelian answer to materials with specific dissipation properties. By varying the plasma frequency in rapid pulses, it was possible to induce structural resonance in any known material, essentially shaking the target's atoms until disintegration. It was a technology that had taken 300 years to develop and, until that moment, had proven effective against all tested materials. The unbreakable resistance responded, not with communication, not with reinforced shields, not with evasive maneuver. It responded with the first of 2 revelations that would completely redefine Imperial understanding of what humanity had been doing in the 230 years of its confinement. From the human vessel's starboard flank, a series of circular openings erupted, and from within them came projectiles, solid metal projectiles. This was so unexpected that the automatic defense system of the 7 Aurelian vessels took 3 seconds to classify them as a threat. In all recorded history of the Imperial Archive, spanning 46 distinct spacefaring civilizations and 22 interstellar conflicts, no species had used kinetic ammunition in space combat after achieving hyperspace travel capability. It was considered primitive, inefficient, a stage through which all civilizations passed and then abandoned once they discovered that energy fields were superior in all relevant aspects. What the Aurelian engineers had not calculated, could not have calculated, because no species had reached this conclusion on their own, was what happens when you accelerate a high-density metal projectile to a significant fraction of the speed of light. Aurelian energy shields were designed to absorb and dissipate electromagnetic and plasma energy. They did this exceptionally well. They were essentially field barriers that interacted with photons and charged particles. A 200-kilogram tungsten projectile traveling at 0.8 the speed of light was not photons. It was not charged particles. It was mass. It was pure kinetic force. It was Newton and Einstein compressed into a dark cylinder that did not interact with energy fields in the way shield engineers had planned, because there was nothing in the Aurelian shield design manual that contemplated the possibility that someone would still use metal projectiles. The first projectile pierced the energy shield of the nearest Sentinel vessel as if it did not exist, and impacted the hull with a force equivalent to the simultaneous detonation of 3,000 tons of conventional explosives. The vessel spun out of control, its propulsion systems deactivated, its internal structure compromised, but, and this detail would be extensively analyzed by Imperial engineers in the following months, not destroyed. The crew was in grave danger, but alive. The projectile had been precisely calibrated to neutralize without annihilating. The second, third, and fourth projectiles followed at 0, 4-second intervals, each targeting a different propulsion system on the vessels surrounding the unbreakable resistance. In 11 seconds, the delta formation of 7 warships had been transformed into 7 drifting objects, slowly rotating in the vacuum, unable to move or fire but with intact crews and functional life support systems. The unbreakable resistance had suffered no visible damage. And then it did the second thing no one in Varek Soln's holography room expected. It retreated. It did not flee. It did not accelerate out of Sector Keth Dovar at maximum speed. It retreated methodically, like a living being that had made its point and had nothing more to prove at that moment, opening distance from the Delta Formation's wreckage with the same disturbing calm with which it had appeared. "Admiral," Zethia said, and his voice had acquired a quality Varek had never heard in a subordinate. Not panic, but something just below panic, the zone where the brain begins to recalibrate reality. "The vessel is moving away. There's no warp propulsion signature yet. They appear to be retreating at sublight impulse." Varek did not respond for a long moment. He was looking at the 7 points of light that represented his warships, the best containment vessels in Sector Keth Dovar, now incapacitated in 11 seconds by a craft that technically should not exist. "Track it," he said finally. "I want to know where it goes. I want to know its exact origin. I want every piece of available intelligence on the Sol 3 species within the next 2 work cycles." "Admiral," Leth Savan said hesitantly, "the Council's sealed records on that species. There's a footnote in one of the observation reports, from one of the last stealth drones to overfly their planet 70 years ago. The observer recorded that this species has a word in one of their primary languages. A word they use to describe themselves when confronted with impossible adversity." "What word?" Leth Savan consulted the file. She found the line. She read aloud the phonetic transliteration, and then the translation that the drone's linguist had recorded with a note of uncertainty. Possibly no perfect equivalent in Aurelian languages. The closest concept would be something between tenacity and creative stubbornness in the face of the inevitable. The word was Gambiara. Varek stared at that word for a long moment. Then he looked at the 7 wrecks slowly spinning in the inner ring. And then, for the first time in 42 years of active service, Fleet Admiral Varek Soln, a being who had navigated wars, survived political betrayals, and commanded fleets that obscured entire star systems, felt something that took him several seconds to identify, for it was a sensation that imperial supremacy had almost extinguished in his species. It was humility. At that same hour, somewhere in space between Keth Dovar and Outer Rim Sector 7, the unbreakable resistance continued its methodical retreat. Its communication systems, which Imperial sensors continued to track with increasing difficulty, transmitted a single message in standard Aurelian language, very brief, without rhetorical flourish or elaborate threat. 7 words. That was just one of ours. The Aurelian Supreme Council met in closed chambers only under 3 circumstances: dissolution of a member state, election of a sovereign, or extinction-level threat. The emergency summons that occurred 48 hours after the Keth Dovar incident was technically classified under the 3rd category, although the 9 counselors who took their seats around the 10-meter crystal table preferred to think of it as a crisis management exercise. Admiral Varek's full report had arrived with all sensor data intact, all combat logs, and a personal appendix he had added unsolicited, a recommendation that the Council consult the sealed files on Sol 3 before making any decisions. The appendix had been noted. It had been ignored. Supreme Counselor Yara Del opened the session with a direct question. How long do we need to mobilize a sufficient response to ensure the surrender or elimination of the invading vessel? High Commander Orath Ven, who had been awakened 3 hours into his sleep cycle and had clearly not processed the received information well, replied with the speed of someone whose training superseded judgment. 2 standard weeks for a response fleet of 400 vessels, including 8 line ships with antimatter main cannons. More than sufficient for any single vessel, regardless of its origin. Approved, Yaradel said. The only counselor who voted against was the elder Meth Sor, who had been the main architect of the containment treaty 230 years prior. He voted in silence, recorded his objection in the official registry, and after the session went to his office to reread, for the first time in decades, the full Sol 3 observation reports. When he finished 3 hours later, he was no longer a man who thought things would go well. The fleet of 400 vessels was designated Keth Response Force, placed under the personal command of High Commander Orath Ven, and departed with the pomp and formality appropriate to an irreversible demonstration of imperial strength. The orbital shipyards of 12 systems broadcast the departure live to the entire population of the Empire. It was a message not only to the unbreakable resistance, but to any other peripheral system that might be watching. This is the consequence of audacity. Orath Ven found the human vessel exactly where Imperial trackers had indicated, stationary in orbit around an unnamed moon on the outer edge of Outer Rim Sector 7, as if waiting. What slightly disturbed the High Commander was that it remained only one vessel. Intelligence reports had mentioned hidden fleets, but no sensor had detected other human craft within 18 hours of sublight travel. Perhaps the intelligence report exaggerated, suggested his executive officer, Veth Clan. Perhaps, Orath Ven agreed. Full blockade formation. I want all main cannons charged before we open communication. The formation of 400 vessels took 40 minutes to arrange itself around the unbreakable resistance. When it was finally complete, it was visually impressive. A hemisphere of metal and light covering all escape angles, with the 8 antimatter main cannons positioned in a triangle around the human vessel like fingers around a throat. Orath Ven opened the communication channel with all the authority of a being who commands the greatest military power in the galaxy. Human vessel designated Unbreakable Resistance. You are completely surrounded by 400 combat units of the Aurelian Imperial Force. Surrender immediately. Transfer control of your systems to our boarding team, and we guarantee the preservation of your crew's lives during the interrogation process. This is the only offer that will be made. The silence lasted 7 seconds. Then the Unbreakable Resistance responded, and this time it was with a human voice. The Empire's universal translators worked for 1 second to process the language and inflection, and the result was a female voice, calm, with the kind of serenity found in people who are not scared because they have already calculated all scenarios and are satisfied with the numbers. High Commander Orath Ven. My name is Commander Elena Vasquez of the Human Expeditionary Force, Warship Unbreakable Resistance. I appreciate the offer, but I decline. I would like to inform you, with all the respect one commander owes another, that you are about to make the same mistake Admiral Soln made in Keth Dovar, with proportionally greater consequences. I recommend you reevaluate. Orath Ven felt the irritation of someone whose power had never been questioned with such calm. Your vessel is completely enclosed. There is no possible escape. What exactly do you imagine you can do? Another pause, shorter this time. I can show you what a single human vehicle can do against 400 warships, or you can retreat, and we can have a conversation about why we came here and what we actually want. One of those options results in a lot less debris. Orath Ven did not respond. He gave the order to fire. The 8 antimatter cannons fired first. They were the ultimate weapon in the Imperial arsenal, capable of annihilating targets the size of a small moon. And for the first time in real combat, they were being used against a single target. What happened next was documented in precise detail by the sensor logs of 397 of the 400 vessels present, as 3 were hit by human projectiles in the first 4 seconds and had their recording systems compromised. The unbreakable resistance was not standing still, waiting for impact. It accelerated, not in a smooth curve, not in a graceful arc calculated to maximize fuel efficiency. It accelerated in a straight line, with a brutality of vector that no Aurelian vessel could execute, because the required acceleration would have turned any biological crew into liquid inside their own pressure suits. Trackers calculated 38 gravities of sustained acceleration in the first 3 seconds, 38 times the standard gravitational force of a planet. The antimatter beams swept through the space where the vessel had been, and then the unbreakable resistance was amidst the formation, and the secondary cannons were firing at all angles simultaneously, and the kinetic projectiles were crossing the space between the vessels at speeds that Imperial interception systems had not been designed to handle, because no engineer had predicted that anyone would still use solid metal on a space combat scale. 6 minutes and 43 seconds after the first shot, the Keth response force had been reduced to a collection of damaged vessels floating in chaotic formation, their propulsion systems compromised, their main cannons inactive. No vessel had been destroyed. Each impact had been surgically calibrated to neutralize offensive capability without eliminating life support. 397 warships of the greatest galactic empire in known history, incapacitated by a single human vessel in less than 7 minutes. Commander Vasquez's voice returned to the air with the same calm as before. "Hi, Commander Orath Ven. You are alive. Your crew is alive. All your vessels are alive. This was our choice, not our limitation. I would like you to transmit the following message to your council. We did not come to take your throne. We did not come to conquer your territory. We came to make it clear that the containment treaty is over, that humanity exists beyond your reach now, and that the next stage of this conversation can be diplomatic, or it can be the deployment of our full fleets. We will not send another single vessel. If forced, we will send everything." A 2-second pause. "Have a good cycle, High Commander." The unbreakable resistance activated its warp drive, whose hyperspace trail, sensors registered with complete confusion, was absolutely different from any known warp signature, as if humans had discovered a completely different method of space-time manipulation, and disappeared. Amidst the wreckage of the greatest military humiliation in Aurelian history, Orath Ven remained silent for a long time. Then he picked up his personal communicator and called the council. There was also a message for the Empire's population, who had watched the fleet's triumphant departure and now awaited news of human surrender. Orath Ven had no idea how to convey what had happened. What had happened did not fit into any narrative the Empire had built about itself over centuries of supremacy. In the adjacent room, his executive officer Veth Clan was quiet, staring at the screen that still showed the empty space where the unbreakable resistance had been. "How," Veth Clan said eventually, "do they survive 38 gravities of acceleration?" It was the right question. It was, in fact, the question that defined everything, and no one in the Empire had an answer. The answer to Veth Clan's question took the Aurelian Commonwealth Galactic Empire 3 standard months, 42 specialized scientists, and clandestine access to hull fragments that had detached from the unbreakable resistance during the antimatter cannon impacts at Keth Dovar. Microscopic fragments, but enough for a metallurgical analysis that completely rewrote what the Imperial Archive thought it knew about materials engineering. The alloy was not simply iron titanium with ceramics. It was a layered structure of absurd complexity, with atomic thickness carbon fibers interwoven in patterns that Imperial computational models took weeks to even adequately represent. More disturbing still, there was evidence of repairs in the fragments. Not automated repairs performed by molecular precision nanobots, as any Imperial engineer would expect. Repairs performed manually, with welds applied by direct contact tools, imprecise by Aurelian standards, but functionally effective in a way that Imperial specialists called, in their reports, structural improvisation with surprising results. The word Gambiara appeared again in the reports. As for resistance to extreme accelerations, the answer was simpler and more disturbing. Humans had modified their own bodies, not with Aurelian or equivalent technological implants. With a combination of deliberate biological selection over generations, physical training that Imperial medical models classified as potentially lethal for any other known species, and life support suits that applied real-time compensatory pressure, they had essentially decided that becoming compatible with the combat needs of their vessels was more efficient than building vessels compatible with their biological limitations. Dr. Sella Vorn, the archive's leading xenobiology specialist, read the report 3 times before writing her conclusion. This species treats its own body as an engineering problem to be solved. She submitted the report to the Council with a personal note that was not part of the official protocol. I strongly recommend that we do not attempt a third military confrontation. The Council was reaching the same conclusion for less scientific and more political reasons. The live broadcast of the Keth Response Force's departure had reached every system in the Empire. The broadcast of its return had not been live, but images leaked. 397 warships missing propulsion systems, towed back to repair yards by utility vessels. High Commander Orath Ven removed from command by order of the Sovereign, the Imperial narrative of absolute supremacy with a visible crack that any citizen with eyes could see. The cautious trade that followed in subsequent months was not exactly a deliberate political decision. It was more a natural evolution of the space created by the absence of ability to force any other option. Human merchant vessels began to appear in the Empire's outer ports, carrying materials that Imperial suppliers did not produce with such density or consistency. Hardware, alloys, structural components of a quality that port inspectors initially rejected for not conforming to any Aurelian certification standards, and that field engineers who tried to use them never wanted to replace with anything else. The humans who appeared in the ports did not match the image of conquerors that Imperial propaganda had quickly built after Keth Dovar. They were noisy, yes. They consumed hot beverages with stimulant concentrations that the Drev Sector port doctor recorded as potentially toxic for 3 of the 6 species present in that port, and the humans themselves called that liquid coffee with the reverence of someone referring to something sacred. They laughed often and loudly. They asked questions about absolutely everything, with a curiosity that seemed not calculated but genuine, the kind of curiosity of a child who has just discovered that the universe is bigger than they thought and wants to touch everything. And they fixed things. This, more than any other characteristic, was what began to change the narrative in the Empire's peripheral sectors. A human engineer named Marcus Okafor, who was passing through Veldrath port on a cargo vessel, spent 3 days repairing the station's atmospheric filtering system, which had been at reduced capacity for 2 years because the certified replacement part was on an 18-month waiting list in the Imperial Suppliers Catalog. Okafor looked at the system with that expression that Aurelian observers would later learn to recognize as the human expression of an interesting problem, asked for basic tools and welding material, and rebuilt the defective part from components available on the station itself. The solution was not elegant. It had incorrect angles and junctions that no certified Aurelian engineer would approve in a formal inspection. But it worked. And it continued to work for 4 years after Okafor left. The Veldrath station administrator recorded the event in the local archive and added an observation that was reproduced in several other station logs over the following years. There is something in this species' problem-solving process that does not fit into any of the engineering paradigms I know. They don't ask, what is the correct solution? They ask, what works? But peace was fragile, and the fractures were in the places where weaknesses always lie, in individuals who could not accept that the world had changed. Retired Admiral Dreth Kale had not accepted Orath Ven's removal as a lesson. He had accepted it as an injustice. In his narrative, the Empire had been betrayed by cowardly leaders who bowed before peripheral barbarians, and the solution was not diplomacy, but rather force applied differently. Not against the human vessel, which had proven invulnerable to direct approach, but against targets that humans could not defend with a single warship. The mining operations in Sector 6 asteroids, where human engineers worked alongside workers of 3 different species in a cooperative operation that was, in Dreth Kale's eyes, a humiliating demonstration of the new order. The attacks by Dreth Kale's renegade factions were surgical in the first 3 months. Interference with navigation systems, sabotage of communication equipment, small operations that could be attributed to technical failures if one chose not to look too closely. The goal was to provoke a disproportionate human response that would give the Council justification to resume a military stance. What they received was completely different from what they expected. A fleet of black vessels emerged in the asteroid belt of Sector 6 as silently as the unbreakable resistance had appeared in Keth Dovar. No visible engines, no energy signature. They simply were there where they had not been. And when Dreth Kale's renegade fleets attempted their next sabotage operation, they found their propulsion systems paralyzed by a surgically precise electromagnetic pulse that specifically neutralized offensive systems without touching life support systems. Then the black vessels approached the captured aggressors, and a human voice transmitted in standard Aurelian language a message that had been carefully constructed to leave a single obvious option and a single terrible option. Your offensive systems have been neutralized. Your crew is alive and comfortable. You have 2 choices. Accept towing back to Imperial space with the guarantee that this operation will not be reported to the Council as an act of war, provided you completely cease all future hostile activity, or we can escalate this situation to the level of open conflict. If you choose the second option, we will be happy to comply. But I would like you to know that we did not send these vessels because we were obligated to. We sent them because we still prefer the first option. Dreth Kale, for reasons that probably had more to do with pragmatism than wisdom, chose the first option. The following week, a human representative named Dr. Amara Ose arrived at Imperial Council headquarters with a formal invitation for trade negotiations and a gift. A memory crystal containing the complete files of every sabotage operation by Dreth Kale's renegades, duly documented, for the Council's use as the Council saw fit. Supreme Counselor Yara Dell, who had approved the 400-vessel fleet without hesitation, looked at the memory crystal for a long moment before accepting it. "Why are you giving us this?" she asked. "You could use it as leverage." Dr. Ose smiled with the expression that Aurelian observers had begun to catalog as the human smile of someone about to say something that seems simple, but that the other person will think about for weeks. "Because we don't need leverage," she said, "we need neighbors." Centuries are a unit of time that most civilizations treat as abstract until one suddenly finds oneself within one, looking back and realizing that everything has changed so gradually that there was no single moment where the change was visible, but the result is unrecognizable compared to the starting point. Commander Elena Vasquez had long since become a historical figure. Her name engraved on the bow of a frontier station that served as a diplomatic meeting point between humans and Aurelians. The cautious commercial system that began had expanded to include 14 species. Humanity had discovered, throughout this process, that it had a peculiar talent for finding common ground between civilizations that preferred to ignore each other. There was something in the human willingness to treat any intelligent being with the same mixture of curiosity and pragmatic respect that made humans effective as intermediaries in disputes that other species considered irresolvable on principle. But centuries had also taken humanity further. The deep space explorer Chronos was different from the warships that had inaugurated human contact with the Aurelian Commonwealth Galactic Empire. It was smaller, more delicate in its silhouette, built not to absorb tungsten projectiles, but to survive the conditions of extragalactic vacuum, where background radiation was different, matter was scarcer, and the distance from the nearest galaxy made any emergency an exercise in absolute self-sufficiency. It carried a crew of 12 people, and, in its central cargo bay, a capsule internally named the Species Archive. The DNA of 100,000 humans selected to represent maximum genetic diversity, complete historical records from the earliest written records to the week before departure, and a series of radio transmissions that represented, in the assessment of the cultural council that compiled them, the best humanity had produced in terms of art, science, philosophy, and humor. They also included, because the curation team had had a moment of rare honesty, samples of the worst human moments: wars, crimes, collective moral failures, the parts of history that would be easier to omit, but which, in the assessment of Dr. James Okonkwo, project director, made the archive honest in a way that selective glorification never could. "If we find someone out there," Okonkwo had said in the launch speech, "they deserve to know the real version of us, not the version we wish we had been." The Chronos was 7 months from the galactic edge when the Vigilance appeared. There was no prior record of the Vigilance in any archive of any of the 15 species that made up the human diplomatic network. There were no rumors, no legends, not even the vague myths that usually precede the discovery of ancient civilizations. They simply appeared suddenly, which Captain Sarah Chen, daughter and granddaughter of engineers, and therefore fluent in the language of impossible situations, recorded in her ship's log with the precision of someone trained not to panic: object of unknown origin, approximate dimensions of 140 kilometers long by 60 wide, no detectable energy emission in known spectra, no residual propulsion signature of any known type. The Chronos was tiny in comparison. A grain of sand next to a mountain. The communication arrived directly in the universal translation systems on a frequency that communications engineer Rahul Sharma described as simultaneously all frequencies and no specific frequency, which he noted as something he would need to investigate in terms of mechanics if he survived the next period of time. The message was clear and had clearly been constructed with prior access to every language file humanity had compiled, implying that the Vigilance had been observing for a long time. "You identify as humans. You emerge from a galaxy where you have established a significant presence in a remarkably short evolutionary time. You transport genetic material and historical archives, which we interpret as an attempt to establish a permanent legacy beyond the confines of your home galaxy. Our protocol requires risk assessment of expanding species. The assessment determines whether expansion is permitted to continue or must be contained. We will begin assessment immediately." Chen read the message twice. Then she turned to Sharma. "They said contained." "Yes, Captain," as in how they contained other species before. "That's the most natural interpretation, yes." Chen was silent for a moment. Then she activated the communication channel and responded with the calm, direct voice she had inherited from a long line of people who learned that anxiety is an emotion and action is a choice. "Vigilance. We received your message. We are available for the assessment. Before you begin, we would like to ask a question. Have you ever assessed a species that voluntarily brought with it both its best moments and its worst documented mistakes?" The pause before the answer lasted 47 minutes. "No." "Then," Chen said, "we suggest you start there. The assessment process that followed lasted 22 standard days and involved a level of access to the human mind and history that no external being had ever obtained. The vigilants, whom the crew gradually understood to be not exactly physical beings, but patterns of information so ancient that the concept of age had lost operational meaning for them. Cognitive processes that had existed long enough to have observed the formation of galaxies delved into the Chronos' archives with an intensity that onboard sensors registered as a constant stream of queries, readings, and what Sharma described as verification proofs, as if they were checking the authenticity of each record. They reviewed the wars. They spent particular time studying the 20th century of terrestrial history, with its industrial-scale catastrophes and horrors. They also studied the decades that followed, when humanity began, slowly and with painful relapses, to build structures that made those catastrophes progressively less likely to recur. On the 15th day, Okonkwo, who had insisted on accompanying the mission despite his 83 years, received a direct communication request from the vigilance. Not for the captain, for him. "You included the records of failures," said the vigilance voice, which sounded different in direct communication, less monolithic, more like a conversation between individuals than an institutional pronouncement. "Yes," said Okonkwo. "Why?" Okonkwo thought for a moment. It was a question that seemed simple and was not. "Because a being who knows only their successes does not know where their weaknesses lie. And a being who does not know their weaknesses cannot monitor them. We believe it is more honest, and honesty about oneself is, in our experience, the first step to not repeating the mistakes you have made. We have found species that believed they had overcome their destructive impulses," the voice said. "They were mistaken. We are probably also mistaken to degrees we have not yet discovered," said Okonkwo. "But there is a difference between being mistaken and being incorrigible. We are here, not because we believe we are perfect. We are here because we still believe it is worth trying to be better." Another pause, shorter this time. "The risk assessment of this species is complex," the voice said. "You possess significant destructive capability. You have demonstrated its use. And yet we destroyed no one we could have destroyed," said Chen, who had silently entered the room during the conversation. "Yes, that is the part that does not follow the expected pattern." "What is the expected pattern?" "Species with destructive capability of this magnitude either exercise it to the extinction of others or are extinguished by others. You have done neither. It is statistically anomalous." Chen looked at Okonkwo. He looked at her. There was something in that moment, a shared second of silent recognition, that needed no words between two people who understood the weight of the question. "Perhaps," Chen said to the vigilance, "it is because we learned, late and at great cost, that destroying is easy and building is difficult. And when you truly learn that, destruction loses its appeal." On the 22nd day, the vigilants transmitted their decision. It was not an absolution. It was not a certificate of perfection. It was something that, when the crew read it, no one was sure how to classify for a moment. It was a memory crystal, containing, according to the accompanying message, the errors and successes of civilizations that had reached where humanity was arriving and chosen different paths, not as a manual, as a mirror. "We monitor," said the vigilance voice. "That is what we do. But this time we left something behind, so that you can monitor us back." Chen held the crystal in her hands for a long moment. It was the first time in documented history that the vigilance had given something to a species under assessment. The first time in a period of time that the crew could not process into comprehensible units. The Chronos remained stationary in the void between galaxies, tiny and motionless, and slowly the 140 kilometers of the vigilance vessel began to recede, until they were just a star among stars, and then nothing. Sharma broke the silence first. "I think we passed." "We didn't pass anything," Chen said. "We were noticed. There's a difference." She still held the crystal. "But being noticed," she added after a moment, "is a start." The anomaly was not on the map. This was technically impossible because the decentralized Galactic Federation, which had existed long enough for the names of its founders to be known only by history specialists and transition period enthusiasts, had mapped every gravitational phenomenon, every region of space-time distortion, and every radiative aberration within 15,000 light-years of the galactic center. The map was the product of 6 centuries of cooperative work between 43 species, the most ambitious monument to collective knowledge any civilization had ever attempted to build. And yet, when Dr. Mia Ose Vasquez activated the deep-range sensors of the Threshold of Knowledge research station on a standard morning that had begun exactly like all other mornings of her 18-year career in frontier astrophysics, the system marked an anomaly in a region catalogued as empty with the same degree of bureaucratic certainty with which it might have marked an incomplete file. Temporal anomaly detected. Sector VX9. Informal file designation. The Echo. Mia looked at the marking. Then she consulted the historical anomalies file, because that was always the first thing to do before reporting anything, to avoid the embarrassment of discovering that you were excited about a discovery someone else had made 300 years ago. The historical anomalies file contained an entry for the Echo. It was ancient, more than 400 years old. The original entry had been made by an Aurelian scientist named Reth Savar and consisted of instrumental observations and a personal note that had survived because it was attached to the official record, not as data but as context. "I cannot determine if what I observe is a measurement anomaly or something real. The sensation upon approaching is that space there has memory. I have no better language for it." Mia read the note twice. Then she looked at the marking on the map. Then she began to prepare to go there. The journey to the Echo took 3 days in the research vessel Ariadne's Thread. Named after a human mythological concept Mia had found in the historical archive in adolescence, and that had stayed with her. The idea of a thread you can follow to exit the labyrinth, provided you remember where you tied it at the entrance. There was something in that image that defined her as a scientist. The belief that any problem has a thread, and that the task was to find it. The Echo was visible to the naked eye when the Ariadne's Thread came close enough. A distortion in space, almost imperceptible except for the way the stars behind it seemed slightly displaced from their catalogued positions, as if space in that specific region was doing something that space should not do. The sensors confirmed what the eyes intuited. A stable space-time curvature bubble, approximately 2 kilometers in diameter, with properties that the team's theoretical models took 17 hours to describe without internal contradictions. "It's a temporal anomaly," said the team's theoretical physicist, Dr. Luca Ferretti, with the voice of someone who is describing something they are convinced they will need to publish urgently, but are not yet sure they will be believed. Space within the bubble is experiencing time non-linearly. Past, present, and future events coexist within it as layers, as if time were a palimpsest and not a line. "What happens if someone goes in?" Mia asked. Ferretti looked at her with the expression of someone who recognizes that the question is already the answer. "They would experience time as it exists within the bubble," he said. "Non-linearly, it would be. Probably indescribable in terms of the languages we use to describe temporal experience." Mia went. Security protocol required Research Council approval, a 3-week risk assessment, the presence of a specialized medical team, and Federation approval for any direct interaction with Class S anomalies. The security protocol had been created by people who had never been in front of a temporal anomaly at 3 in the morning of a monitoring shift. Alone, except for a team of 8 people who trusted them, with an Ariadne's thread pointing into the labyrinth and the most important scientific question of their careers waiting on the other side. Mia entered. What she experienced inside the Echo lasted, from the perspective of external sensors and the team monitoring her vital signs, exactly 43 minutes. From Mia's perspective, it lasted long enough for the concept of how long it lasted to lose all relevance. She saw the unbreakable resistance emerge in Sector Keth Dovar as it had centuries before, but she saw it from an impossible angle, from inside and out simultaneously, feeling the weight of the decisions Commander Vasquez had made at that moment. The awareness of the risk and the equally firm awareness that the time had come for a conversation that had been postponed for 230 years too long. She saw Okonkwo holding the vigilance crystal with his 83-year-old hands, and she felt what he had felt. Not triumph, but something quieter and deeper. The satisfaction of someone who bet on honesty instead of impression and found that the bet paid off. She saw moments that had not yet happened, or that perhaps were happening in parallel, or that had happened in versions of the present that she did not occupy. The Federation expanding beyond any border she knew, species in contact that in her time had not yet met, crises that were yet to come and that would be resolved in ways she could not predict but could feel the logic, the same logic that had worked before, the logic of not destroying when one can build, of not silencing when one can listen, of not closing one's hand when one can open it. And at some point in this experience that resisted all attempts at linear narrative, she understood what the Echo was. It was not a physical anomaly. It was a memory so vast and so ancient that it had folded space-time around itself by the sheer weight of everything that had happened and everything that was yet to happen. It was the record not of events, but of what events meant, the layer beneath the facts where resided the reason why things mattered. And what the Echo remembered, above all, what was at its center like the core of a star, was simple and absurd and completely fitting. In all possible paths history could take, in all versions where fear won or distrust prevailed or power corrupted without remedy, there was always this alternative, this persistent thread, this possibility that refused to be extinguished, where one being chose to see another being as a neighbor and not as a threat. There was always someone who chose to open their hand. Mia emerged from the Echo 43 minutes after entering, according to external records. Ferretti met her in the re-entry chamber with the expression of someone trying to assess whether they needed to call the medical team. "Are you all right?" Mia was silent for a moment. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of someone who is translating an experience into words for the first time and wants to get it right. "Yes," she said. "I'm fine. I need to write a very long report." "What did you see in there?" Mia thought. Then she said the most precise thing she could. "Everything that has ever happened and some things that are yet to happen. And the reason why we keep trying." "What is the reason?" She looked at him. Then she looked out the re-entry chamber window at space, where the Echo shone with that subtle displacement of the stars behind it. A labyrinth that had a thread if you knew how to look. "Because fear is the only real barrier," she said. "All technology, all weapons, every containment treaty, and every fleet of 400 vessels. It was fear. And every conversation, every open hand, every memory crystal handed over by beings who had never handed anything over before. It was the choice not to be afraid, or to be afraid and act anyway." Ferretti was quiet for a moment. "Will that go in the report?" The first sentence of the report. The Ariadne's thread remained docked beside the Echo for another 4 days while the team collected data, and during those 4 days Mia wrote the most important report of her career. A document that would be read by scientists from 43 species, and that would begin, exactly as she had promised, with that sentence. In the last lines of the report, Mia wrote something that was not scientific data, but that the editor of the Federation's research journal decided to include anyway, because there were things that were true in ways that data alone did not capture. She wrote, "The first human vessel that entered Imperial space did not carry diplomats. It carried warriors. But the warriors chose not to kill when they could have killed, and that choice was more powerful than any weaponry they carried. Centuries later, we are not the masters of the galaxy. We are its most stubborn memory, the memory that there is always another way, as long as someone chooses to look for it." The galaxy had changed. It would continue to change. And somewhere in the void between the stars, where space gently curved around an ancient memory, the Echo continued to remember everything that had mattered. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier. New stories emerge every week from the void between the stars, and the next one might be the most epic of all.